As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
That's causing a great deal of tension, it's causing a great deal of distress. It's upsetting people's livelihoods, it's breaking down ecosystems that have been in place for thousands of years. They've got to collaborate with their neighbors and understand, again, we're all drinking the same water just as we're all breathing the same air.
From the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, welcome to another episode of the Security Nexus Webinar, where we explore the most pressing security challenges and geopolitical shifts shaping our world today. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army retired and professor here at DKI APCSS. It's a pleasure to have you with us for episode 26, Shared Waters, Shared Futures, Cooperative Approaches to Water Security in the Indo-Pacific. Water, the essence of life itself, is under immense strain in this vital and diverse region, from the towering glaciers of the Himalayas to the sprawling deltas of Southeast Asia, from bustling megacities to remote island communities. Water availability and quality are increasingly precarious. Over 500 million people in the Indo-Pacific lack access to even a basic water supply, and a staggering 2.5 billion lack safely managed drinking water. These numbers paint a stark picture of a crisis unfolding in slow motion, one with profound implications for human well-being, economic development, and regional stability. Climate change, with its intensifying droughts, floods, and heat waves, disrupts the delicate balance of water systems across the Indo-Pacific. Rapid urbanization and industrialization are placing unprecedented demands on already scarce resources. Pollution from agriculture, industry, and untreated sewage contaminates rivers, lakes, and groundwater, poisoning serious health risks. And transboundary water disputes, fueled by competing national interests and the absence of effective governance mechanisms, threaten to escalate into conflict. The consequences of water insecurity are far-reaching. Crop failures and food shortages can lead to economic hardship and social unrest. Waterborne diseases can spread rapidly, overwhelming healthcare systems. Competition for dwindling resources can exacerbate tensions between nations, undermining regional stability. The Indo-Pacific is a region of immense strategic importance, home to some of the world's fastest growing economies and most dynamic societies. Yet, the water crisis casts a long shadow over its future. If left unaddressed, it could derail progress, ignite conflict, and undermine the very foundations of peace and prosperity. Today, we had the privilege of exploring these complex issues with an expert in the field, Dr. Ethan Allen. Dr. Allen is an environmental, climate, and water security expert and a contributing author to the forthcoming book, The Indo-Pacific Mosaic, Comprehensive Security Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, commemorating this center's 30th anniversary. Now, I have the privilege of being the editor of this volume, and Dr. Allen will be sharing insights from his chapter, Shared Water, Shared Futures, Cooperative Approaches to Water Security in the Indo-Pacific, providing us with a unique understanding of this growing security challenge. Ethan, thank you for joining us today, and it is a pleasure to have you back on this program. We were talking just before the program, and several months have gone by. You were on episode 3, and here we are today on 26.
Excellent.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you here. You know, you'll know from then that by practice, we invite our guests to share their journey. So tell us your story.
Well, thank you, James. It's actually rather odd that I find myself here at this center doing this sort of work. I have no idea that I would do this in my younger years. I was trained actually as a biologist, really as a behavioral biologist. I spent years of my life doing laboratory research, looking at fish and fish visual systems, and then how visual systems develop. Later, I studied issues about reptile reproduction. I moved to different fields. I did informal science education, working for science and technology centers and museums. I worked on science education in the formal sector, developing grant proposals and setting up programs for schools to better K-12 science education. I've worked out in the Pacific Islands, and that's what got me involved in the water issues. I was doing some informal science out there, and I ended up moving here sort of in the realm of crisis management. That is, I was helping these islands avoid water crises, which, of course, crisis avoidance is really the best form of crisis management, right?
Well, you've been here for several years now. You came, it's been 5, 6 years? How long has it been?
A little over 5 years.
5 years. I remember when you came, and a true scientist in our midst. So a little less traditional path that some have come here.
Yes.
And you have been engaged in this aspect of it. And, you know, without a doubt, I think the importance of water security is underappreciated by a large group of people who would consider them security practitioners. And so, you know, I noted some of that in the opening as we spoke. And I mean, but the Indo-Pacific region, without a doubt, I mean, it faces this complex and growing water crisis. And it impacts everything from individual livelihoods to regional stability. So maybe we'll start this off with this question. I mean, could you begin by painting a picture of the current water security landscape in the Indo-Pacific and the most pressing challenges that we face?
Sure. As you hinted in your introduction there, it's a very big and complex picture, though. Yeah. It varies tremendously. The people up in the Himalayas, in Nepal and Bhutan, face very different water challenges than do the people on the Maldives Islands or the Kiribati or the Marshalls. And everyone in between has sort of nuanced challenges. A lot of them involve quantities of water, either having too much water or too little water. Floods happen, glacial lake outbursts happen, overwash of the ocean over low-lying islands happens. Some involve too little water when the droughts, and you mentioned that the climate change is now making droughts more prolonged, more intense, combined with heat waves particularly. This gets to be a rather bad situation. And some has to do with quality of water, either through naturally occurring contaminants. Many people in Bangladesh, for instance, now they're pumping deep groundwater or drinking water that is contaminated with arsenic. Many people across the world, throughout the world, but particularly around Asia, are drinking water that has basically contamination from coliform bacteria, that is human fecal bacteria. And that's, of course, terribly unhealthy. So it's a broad range of different challenges in different places, quantity, quality, all vary a great deal.
You know, when you're speaking about human fecal count in water, we suffer with that here in Hawaii. Constantly there's the I don't know, I call them warnings, but notices that you know, you should avoid the water at this time because the count is too high and stuff. You must be familiar with that a little bit.
Exactly, and yet, you know, that's truly sort of a first world problem. Right. Yes, today you can't go swimming in a nice ocean that surrounds us because it might possibly be dangerous. If that's your only source of drinking water, though, regardless of whether it's contaminated or not, you have to drink it. Yeah. You cannot go without water for more than 3 days, and even a fraction of that is very, very harmful to deprive yourself of water. So better to drink even contaminated water than no water. And so unfortunately, we have lots and lots of people across the region who literally run sort of ongoing mild disease states from drinking contaminated water.
Let's pull on this then. Let's talk about the sustainable water management. You have well stated now to this point, I mean, clean water is essential for our survival, but also for agriculture and industry across the Indo-Pacific. So here's the question then. Given the critical need for fresh water across all these sectors, what specific strategies can nations implement to manage this vital resource?
It's a big problem. First and foremost, an area that's often not appreciated is conservation and stewardship. The water we have on this planet today is the same water that's been here for 4.5 billion years. The same water molecules, they go around and around and around. They go up in the air, they come down into the ground, they get taken up by living organisms, they fall out of those organisms, get into rivers, go back to the ocean, evaporate up in the sky again. And water is what is called the universal solvent because of its peculiar chemical properties. It's very good at dissolving lots and lots and lots of things and bringing them into a liquid state in it. Therefore, of course, it picks up lots of the chemicals that we now contaminate the earth with. And so more and more of our water is unfortunately contaminated, polluted. So it's a real struggle then to take care of that water, to extract clean water back out, leave the contaminants behind somehow. It's a scientific problem, but it's also a political problem. It's an expense, it's an economic problem. In many cases, it may be some combination of those, a technical and political problem. So it's a huge challenge for, particularly when we get high population densities, right? When you can't just have someone going out and getting water from the nearby stream, but you have 10 million people all together. And when that happens, particularly because water typically has not been well cared for in the past, your water that you have available is often very, very contaminated. In the cities, most of the cities of China, for instance, their groundwater is what they put at a rating of 5 out of a 1 to 5 scale, which means 5 means it is essentially unusable for anything. You cannot drink it, you cannot put it out under agriculture, you cannot use it for industry. You basically can't do anything with it because it is so contaminated.
That's stark. I know in your introduction you had mentioned about your time out in Micronesia, wasn't it?
Yes.
And so my mind was, even during when you're talking about that, this water management, I was thinking about things like water harvesting or the watershed management and all these different things. I wonder if you just might, whether you're pulling on your own examples or things that I might have hinted at, kind of, go a little more deeper in this water management.
Sure. The islands are actually very nice in the sense that they're microcosms of what happens everywhere in the world. All of the water we have basically essentially comes from falling out of the sky sooner or later. And on islands, it becomes very, very clear. In Hawaii here, there was a Hawaiian saying which translates to, when the heavens weep, the earth lives. They understood, the Hawaiians understood that without rain, their streams would dry up. Their crops could not flourish. So they actually took care of the water very well. They actually had people who were appointed and whose job it was to sort of walk the watersheds and be sure that people were managing their water properly. They were taking the right amount and not taking too much. They were not dirtying their water and sending dirty water on down to their neighbors, basically downstream. There's a real awareness of it. And as water gets more and more scarce, that becomes more and more important. So on the low-lying islands, the atolls, where you have no high mountains to gather the water, rainwater catchment becomes absolutely vital. And taking care of that water that you caught becomes a critical task if you were to survive. Now, in the face of climate change, people are having to gather more water because it's not just a matter of, well, I have to have water for 3 or 4 weeks, but maybe I need water now for 2 or 3 months without rain. So more challenges are facing these people.
Well, this takes us right into maybe another topic, and that's about water security crisis, because that's where you're going in these discussions. Climate change, it intensifies the water scarcity and the variability here in this region. So what are the strategies in the countries in the region that they implement to mitigate these impacts on insecure water for all of us?
Right, and it's not just the Indo-Pacific, it is global now. We are seeing this shift. Instead of having a climate that over time has moderate rain, moderate dryness, moderate rain, moderate dryness, we have a climate that's drier, 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 hotter, drier, hotter, drier, and suddenly then has torrential rain, torrential rain, torrential rain, then back to dry, 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 hot, 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 torrential rain. It's a very different distribution of the water falling out of the sky, as it were. And that is, of course, it's much harder on agriculture. It's much harder on the infrastructure because there's more water suddenly on the ground. It cannot soak in fast enough. It then tends to flood, ruins people's homes, businesses, all the infrastructure that people build, and then washes off, dumping loads and loads of sediment on coral reefs, killing them off. And then you have no rain at all for a while. So yes, what countries are doing is beginning to adapt to that. They are trying to build more reservoirs to hold more water. They are becoming aware of the fact that these water crises are very dangerous. There are cities in India where they have literally run out of water, where all the reservoirs for the city has gone dry, and the city basically had to shut down, trucking water from more distant places just to keep the residents alive. That's obviously a terrible state of affairs. You cannot do manufacturing. You cannot do anything in your city except basically survive. So they're trying to build systems to mitigate that. And part of it is this, it's just storing more water, but it's also storing the water better. But then again, a lot of this comes back to conserving water, using it wisely, using it well, and taking care of it. And that part of it, I don't think is being pursued as vigorously and as rigorously as it needs to be.
You spoke about, in your comments about China and their dearth of quality water. And so I'm thinking about, the urbanization and the water demand that comes from there. And clearly China is among those that have urbanized quickly. But throughout this region, globally, it is a drastic relocation of people through urbanization. And as a result of this rapid urbanization, I mean, it's an increased pressure on water resources. And so how do the governments then balance this urban water demand with this need for sustainable management? Yeah.
Yes, it's not been well managed in a lot of cases. China built its sort of economic miracle of raising millions, hundreds of millions of people up out of poverty, really on the back of its water. They essentially told industry, build your industry, run your industry, don't worry about the water end of it. All industry sooner or later involves water. In China, they ran industries, they dumped all their waste willy-nilly into rivers without any sort of treatment. As I say, this went downstream. The coastal cities now, all their groundwater is terribly polluted. It doesn't have to happen. We now have the technologies that if you want to, you can take an individual apartment building, give them a water reservoir, and let it become self-sufficient. Treat all the water in there, and people just keep drinking the same water. People do not like to do that, though. People don't like that idea that they're drinking the same water they flushed down the toilet the other day. That's very unappealing to a lot of people, and yet realistically it happens in the world. We're all drinking the same water that has been through a lot of different animals, and it needs to happen on more and more of a scale. If it happens on a local scale, such as within a building, look, you don't have to pump your water miles and miles away. You've saved a huge amount of energy in doing that.
It's intuitive what you said. That is, the same water molecules have been here for eons. Mm-hmm. But I'm not so sure, despite it being intuitive, that on a pop quiz, most people would have got that answer right. that we're dealing with the same water.
People have real reluctance. They believe, yes, once you flush water down and goes down a drain, it's like
gone, right? And from the heavens come fresh water.
Right. And that is absolutely true, because what evaporates out off the oceans is only water. The salt does not evaporate. The pollutants in general do not evaporate. Just water comes up.
I said fresh. I guess I meant new water, and in fact, it's fresh water.
Right,
it's not
fresh
new
water. Right. There is essentially no new water on the planet.
Fascinating, fascinating. Well, you know, another problem is what we would call this overexploitation of water, right? I'm originally born in Michigan, and though that was some time ago, but you know, I've kept track of some things that happened there, and I was reminded of a number of years ago, Nestle had overexploited quite a bit of water out of there. They were basically taking it for free, bottling it, and selling it to the world. And as if though, you know, to some people, this was a never-ending source. You know, Michigan has these Great Lakes, et cetera, et cetera. And that's perhaps not the case. I mean, there is a real cost to over-extraction. And so what policies and regulatory frameworks can be implemented to prevent this depletion and ensure the long-term water availability that you're talking about?
Yeah, excellent point. Excellent point. Sort of a parallel story. A friend of mine from Southwest England was saying, this was some years ago, I heard this, but he was saying only a few years before had they started charging for water use at all. Water was just considered, all right, you bought a piece of property, you know, house, it had water, free, you know, use whatever water you wanted. We have now come to appreciate that water, particularly in continents, exists in aquifers. That is, water is stored in porous rock underground, basically. Those aquifers are constrained. They typically have impermeable rock surrounding them, so they have a limited amount of water in them. Unfortunately, in many cases in this country, we are still just sucking those aquifers down, even ones that they know have only a very limited capacity left, and they just continue to drain them. Now, the smarter, more forward-looking people do understand you cannot do that. You can't just draw your bank account down and down and down and not keep putting money back into it, right? Your bank account runs out and the bank does not let you take any more money out. That is happening in various places. It has happened. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Some places are making very good strides. The city of Los Angeles has made some tremendous strides about taking their wastewater and dumping it back into basins to allow it to percolate back down in the aquifer and hopefully recharge their aquifer. Many places in the world that's not happening. The northwest part of India and Pakistan, where they grow a lot of the food for the region, the aquifers are shrinking and declining, and it's the case in the northeastern part of China too. It's the case in various places around the world, and including the southwestern US. And it's not a sustainable system. We do need to figure out sooner rather than later how to prevent that.
Not only can they be drained down, they can be contaminated, yes. Aquifers. And this is then not a, I don't know, I was going to say it's not a quick fix. There's probably no fix to restore the aquifer in our lifetime if it's been contaminated.
We have a wonderful, unfortunate example of that right here on Oahu, right, with the Red Hill fuel storage, where they had some leaks of some tens of thousands or perhaps hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel sitting 100 feet above one of the major aquifers, and it got polluted. It looks like, knock on wood, that maybe it was a fairly minor pollution episode. Maybe most of that has now drifted downstream and the aquifers are basically intact, but they continue to discover little bits and traces of various fuel contaminants. Yes, it gets very bad. Again, the atoll islands are very, very prone to that because they have only a very shallow freshwater lens sitting literally sometimes a foot, 2 feet down beneath a sandy surface. So if you dump a can of your car's motor oil onto that, within a matter of days, it is in the water supply, and most of the aquifers can no longer use their freshwater lenses because they are contaminated now. So they're more reliant on catchment, now rainwater catchment.
You spoke earlier at the opening, you were speaking about how these atolls suffer from rising seas as well. You didn't go into it, but I mean, the story here about how seawater can contaminate that as well, those aquifers as well, yes?
Right.
Say more.
Exactly. So particularly in any coastal low-lying regions, but in some the aquifer cases, everything, as the sea level rises, it basically will infiltrate freshwater lenses, particularly if you're pumping out your freshwater lens very rapidly. and essentially making the top of it go down. The seawater will then inundate right over the top of it, and then your whole freshwater lens becomes slightly brackish, and then more brackish, and eventually unusable. So salt is certainly probably one of the major contaminants that has ruined farmland along a number of coastlines already, and again, it's one of the huge problems facing the Indo-Pacific. Is much of the fertile land near the coast is facing that kind of degradation where it cannot be used as good farmland anymore.
Mm. Yeah. I think I want to pull the conversation a little bit towards talking about transboundary water cooperation. Shared rivers in the Indo-Pacific, and you spoke towards some of those, alluded to them anyway. I mean, these are often the sources of tension between nations. And so maybe let me ask you this question. What are the most effective approaches to fostering transboundary cooperation and equitable water sharing?
That's a very tough question.
Yeah, I bet it is.
There are a few models that some have certain attributes that have been very good. Others may have other attributes. The classic is the Indus Water Treaty between Pakistan and India. That was a fairly straightforward agreement, basically brokered by the World Bank, that gave certain branches of the Indus, gave their water to Pakistan, and certain other branches to India. Basically just sort of said, you guys get these rivers, you guys get these other ones. You don't mess with the other guy's water at all. Basically, you can't dam their rivers. You can't suck water out of their rivers beyond customary use. And that's held up since the 1960s. So it's held up for many, many years. It's survived even wars between these countries and probably has prevented others. But there's no provisions in that agreement for sharing data about water. There's no provisions for what happens if the water level starts decreasing, if the water flow in these rivers starts decreasing. What if it happens, the flow in Pakistan's branches decrease faster than the flow in India's decrease? There's all kinds of potential for things to go wrong, basically. There have been movements to try to reopen negotiations and build new aspects to that agreement. And this is what I think has to happen, is when you're looking at transboundary issues, they have to now be informed by not just issues of equity, understanding that all of us need water. We all rely on water. We're all sharing the same water, but also recognize that water flow is a very dynamic situation in rivers, and it comes and goes, it rises, it falls. There may be long-term trends to it. In many of the cases across Asia, as those rivers are glacier fed, the flow right now may be actually increasing in a number of those rivers for the next few decades, right? As a planet warms, as the glaciers continue to melt more and more rapidly. But at some point, of course, there is less ice left in those glaciers. The flow will then irrevocably begin to decline, and may decline very, very severely some decades out here, which is going to leave a lot of those areas scrambling to find new sources of water because we cannot do without it.
My mind was fleeting there for a minute, thinking about on the Korean Peninsula, where I've spent many years over a long period of time. And a lot of the water is flowing from the north to North Korea, South Korea. And when things are going fine, they're going fine. But you spoke about these massive flash floods that can occur, which can trigger the opening up of dams or channels or whatever, and then just unexpected, these rushing of water that can have tremendous detrimental effects in areas that weren't expecting it. And so just so many, tangents of what can happen with the water. And
exactly. And this is why we need to have science and technology working together collaboratively around the region and really around the world, so people can understand and prepare in advance when they can see a major storm coming and say, okay, are our reservoirs ready to handle that safely? Should we now, before that storm gets here, begin to open up and drain our reservoirs so we'll have better capacity when the storm hits? Should the people downstream start to make preparations and perhaps move away from the floodplains temporarily or whatever? And we've gotten much better at that. Floods cause far, far fewer deaths today than they did a few decades ago because we understand them better. We have better warning. But we're getting more extreme floods now. We're getting higher levels of rainfall in shorter periods than we've ever experienced on this planet before. So some of the systems simply are not set up for that. We've seen several examples of that recently, some very devastating floods which have led to dam collapses and then washing out sections of major cities. It's an ugly situation. One of the ways we have to be looking at is to look really at novel ways of getting water, and to think about better ways of getting water. But it also now is a matter, as you sort of hinted at, understanding that water flows where water flows. You need to have the infrastructure in place to deal with that, whether it's dealing with very low flows and salvaging as much as you can, or dealing with very, very high flows and being sure it can be moved quickly and neatly away from the areas, either hopefully to recharge your aquifers, but if not that, at least moved out without destroying people's homes and livelihoods and lives.
I want to pull on your comment about science and tech with regards to water security, and you gave an illustrative example, about that. But there's much more we could kind of talk about. These advances in science and tech. I mean, AI is going to bring about, I would assume, significant opportunities in water security. Desalination plants have been extremely helpful in many locations, though that's not, as new as AI. It is a newer technology. So I guess maybe this is a question: how can Indo-Pacific nations effectively adopt and integrate these innovations? What do you recommend?
So there's a wide range of these innovations. One of the things that came sort of online when I was working out in Micronesia was a simple product called the Maddie Drop. And because in the islands, most of the issue is from essentially contamination, microbial contamination. Again, they're doing rainwater catchment. You're getting water off of your roof. It has decaying leaves. It has bird crap, et cetera, in it. You need to get rid of the bacteria. The simple little point of use decontamination devices called Maddie Drops. You drop them in a dispenser and let the water sit there for 12 hours. It's killed off all the microbes. Leaves no extra taste, doesn't require electricity, doesn't require any filtering. Very simple, beautifully appropriate technology. So
fun fact, I still have a Maddie Drop that you gave me before you actually came to the center as a faculty member. But say a little bit more, because what is a Maddie Drop, and what is it that's doing this? I mean, I know, but I want the audience to have a...
Sure. So it's a simple little cake made from clay, sawdust, and silver nitrate. They're mixed together when the clay is soft and then baked in a kiln. All the sawdust, of course, burns away in the kiln, leaving a very porous clay tablet whose surface is littered with silver ions, basically. So when it's put into water, silver gradually diffuses away from the clay and is in the water in solution. For microbes, silver is extremely toxic. We have a pretty good tolerance for it. The way these Maddie Drops are designed, the water around them gets to a certain level of silver concentration and then holds at that level. That level is completely toxic to viruses, to bacteria, to fungi, to helminths, to almost everything that might do us harm, but is well below the safe level of silver for us to consume. So we can drink the water just fine.
All these years I remembered this. What else on science and tech?
So you mentioned reverse osmosis systems. Wonderful idea, right? Press water through a semi-permeable membrane that only lets the clean water through, keeps all the contaminants on the one side. Great, but it's got problems. These membranes wear out, they catch more gunk, they clog up. People are making those membranes better. The material scientists are making thinner membranes that take less pressure, less energy, that last longer, that are smoother, so it's easier to clean them off. They're more effective. But the really exciting things are now happening with being able actually to filter out contaminants by a simple filter, literally gravity-fed filter. There are now systems that are being developed where you can pour ocean water in at the top and a few minutes later get drinkable water out at the bottom without any external power sources. There are other devices now, they're beginning to work on this whole issue of extracting water from the air. Even in the deserts, your air contains a certain fair amount of water. And if you can pull that out, perhaps using solar power, you can get perfectly good water to drink, and it's quite reasonably clean. So these techniques, still in their infancy, still in being developed, have a great promise to be developed, as we saw with, for instance, solar power, to have the cost of them using them come down to where they can be spread more widely.
Fascinating. I want to take the conversation in a direction that we can talk about conservation and stewardship. I mean, these are key to maintaining water security, yet they're probably often underutilized. So let me ask you this question. What steps can be taken to embed these principles into national water policies?
Well, they really need to be applied sort of across the spectrum, literally from individual use and getting people to understand that, getting individual consumers to realize, yeah, it's not okay just to crank on a faucet and let it run, let water run down a drain. That's really irresponsible behavior fundamentally. That you should, for instance, catch your water that you use for doing dishes, and then you can take that out and dump it in your garden, and it will water your plants. You've made 2 uses of the water. It's cleaned your dishes, and now it's going to water your plants. You can start, municipalities can work on being more conservative with their water. Many water systems are quite, how should we say, porous. They leak after some years. In many cases, this is quite substantial. 20% of the water, 30% of the water may disappear. That they are treating, they're gathering, they're holding, they're treating, they're pumping it into a system, and 20 or 30% of it never makes it to consumers. In many cases, with older systems, it's much more. A friend of mine dealt with Pohnpei in the FSM, putting in new water infrastructure. And when they did that, water use dropped by 95%.
Wow.
They're essentially almost everything they were pumping in was just disappearing before it got to the taps.
You would think, so my wife is a bit of she is very conscious about environment, and so she has on multiple occasions gone past here on Oahu, gone past a water leak somewhere and called it in. We have been surprised at how long it takes to come repair a water leak after it has been reported as you got a lot of water coming out of a pipe. And I think it goes to your point. We have yet to truly, and this is here in Hawaii, and we're talking other places must also suffer similarly. They just do not appreciate the importance of doing this.
Yes, I mean,
conserving water
gets back to, that was one of my original points I made, was this issue of conservation, stewardship of our water is absolutely central to the whole business. We're never going to really make much progress if we cannot embed that kind of stewardship ideals and practices in people's lives. It's just stunning how, as you say, how long it takes. And yes, other places are far worse. You know, as with so many things in the security realm, this depends on good governance, having a governing authority that looks at this, understands that literally this is a security problem. It is a water security problem, and it should be dealt with right away. It should be dealt with effectively. It needs to happen. Unfortunately, that is not. It's all too rarely the case. Yeah.
So you're right. You said this is a security issue, and it is. Water security and regional stability, they are tied together. So let me ask you this question. How can nations collaborate to ensure water security contributes to peace rather than conflict?
Well, you know, Hawaii gives us a nice example. They're written in our state constitution that they are to have a water board, basically, that is really in charge of the water on the island, and has a great deal of authority to manage that water and is charged with managing it well so that all the needs are taken care of. We are the only state that has any such provision. I don't know of any countries that necessarily have that in their legal framework. But something like that is really, I think that level has to be taken on, that level of approach, recognizing this is a fundamental core issue. And yes, the state governments are and must be responsible for ensuring that every level below them is taking care of their water. It is being careful that it's not being wasted, being careful that it's not being polluted, understanding that if you've used it once, maybe you can catch it again and use it a second time in a less important use, then dump it out somewhere and let it percolate back down, recharge your aquifer, and your grandchildren will be drinking that same water. It really needs to happen as a matter of governance.
I think I recall Bhutan, which a country which measures gross national happiness, that they in fact at national level water management policies, but we are woefully behind in taking action, which is exactly why we need to have this discussion today. Exactly why I was excited for you to write about this in our forthcoming edited volume, is because I don't think security practitioners think about this to the degree they should.
It is one of these issues that, particularly in places like the US, we've grown up with this idea. You walk in, you see a tap, you turn on water, good water will flow, you drink without a second thought. There are a lot of places in the world where that doesn't happen. And unfortunately, they're now getting new places in the US where that doesn't happen. But more and more people need to have that consciousness that it is not just an infinite supply that magically appears from nowhere. That water that you're dumping down the sink is the same water you could be drinking. Our ancestors probably drank that same water. Look at that very same glass of water in some sense was consumed many, many times by animals, by plants over the course of eons. And until we understand that and understand that, yes, this is valuable stuff, this is a limited commodity, it takes energy and time to clean it back up after you used it. If you put the time and energy into it, you can clean it back to every bit as pristine as it was in its initial state, and use it again and do the same thing again and again. I was saying earlier that you can set up building-wide or small community-wide systems that have a given reservoir and keep recycling their water indefinitely. You can do that also on a partial level, where you recycle parts of your water and let other parts of it go out, and you reduce your need to use water. So your plumbing for your toilets, for instance, can be on a separate system, instead of the fact that currently in the US, of course, we actually clean our water to drinkable standards before putting it into our toilets and then flushing it down, which is sort of needless, right? But it was designed back when we didn't have that comprehension of water as a very limited resource.
I saw a dystopian movie where all life was pretty much had died off in places. This one in the city, because they had local watershed, because it fed these apartment buildings, and they were able to convert their water exactly as you're speaking right here. I remember from this movie how they were able to sustain this community right here. And it sounds far-fetched who would do this, and yet...
Right, we know it can be done. I mean, the space station, right? They don't have a pipeline run down Earth, right? They have X amount of water on that thing, and they've had that same water since day one when it went up there, and they're drinking it all just fine, right? Yeah. It's perfectly good water.
You've enlightened us tremendously. We have many questions. We probably won't get through them all, but let's go ahead and turn to audience questions. Here's the first one. Vulnerable regions is what they're asking about. How do you see water security evolving for vulnerable regions like the outer atolls of Micronesia, especially with this impact of climate change?
So a lot of those areas, really the key issue, I think, is a science and technology one. It's well, along with again being more prepared for climate change, catching more water, storing more water, but just being able to have better ways to get water, either better ways to run a simpler reverse osmosis system that does not require complex electronics, fancy parts that nobody can get. But hopefully in a few years, you may have just a filter cartridge you can drop in 4 or 5 gallons of salt water and in a few minutes you'll have your 5 gallons of salt water out. And every 3 months you throw that cartridge out and somebody harvests the salts away back from that. That kind of thing. The issues are not so terribly political. They are economic and technical. They do not have a lot of technological expertise often. In other areas, much more gets into the politics of issues. China and the countries downstream in the Mekong, for instance, have some real issues that are going to need to be worked out. China has 11 dams on the Mekong that jointly hold about the 2/3 of the volume of Chesapeake Bay in terms of water. They gather it for hydropower, typically during the wet season, during the monsoons, restricting its flow, meaning the lower Mekong flows lower and is drier. Then during the dry seasons, they open up their dams to get hydropower, which means the Mekong now flows more than it should. So the Mekong's annual flood pulse drought cycle is now being completely disrupted. That's causing a great deal of tension. It's causing a great deal of distress. It's upsetting people's livelihoods. It's breaking down ecosystems that have been in place for thousands of years. They've got to collaborate with their neighbors and understand, again, we're all drinking the same water just as we're all breathing the same air, right?
Let's go ahead and pull this a little bit further, because there's a question dealing with these types of political cross-border type issues. And so this question is asking about the India-Bangladesh water disputes. And so the question is, how can the water disputes between India and Bangladesh be resolved, particularly in relation to India's upstream water diversions?
Yes, I mean, all these issues are very complex. You need to look at the situation. Where's the watershed? Where's the current rainfall coming that feeds that? How much of the watershed lives in one country or another? What's the current use patterns? What are the projected population growth or decline in any given area? What are the projected water flow, either increases or decreases? And talk sensibly and rationally to one another about, okay, we have X amount of water. We both need it. If you use it all and cut it off from me, eventually my people are going to rise up about that, and it's going to be a messy situation. These situations can be dealt with. They, as of yet, have really not been dealt with in the way they need to. Very few of the transboundary water rivers or lakes or whatever have much in the way of joint management. Some of them do, and they need to take the ones that are there, work on them, look at those as models, and build better ones.
Yeah, no, your comment reminded me of Joseph Nye said something like to the effect of, security is like oxygen. You don't tend to think of it until you don't have it. And when that happens, you can think of nothing else.
Exactly.
And so talking about when it becomes an issue, because you're only going a few days without water, you can think of nothing else.
Right. Yeah. When you hit the bottom of your aquifer and it starts sucking air, suddenly you have one big priority, and that's to get water, and really nothing else counts.
Here's another one on geopolitics stuff. This one's on strategic competition in the Bay of Bengal. So given the tensions in the South China Sea, do you foresee similar strategic competition in the Bay of Bengal regarding water resource management?
That's interesting. The 800-pound gorilla in the South China Sea is clearly China.
That's right.
They don't border on the Bay of Bengal, therefore, hopefully that should not be a big problem. Will India, the 800-pound gorilla in the Bay of Bengal, take on that role and try to claim all of the resources as its own? They don't seem inclined to do so. They seem much more inclined to understand that their neighbors also have exclusive economic zones in the ocean. And They seem to be respecting those. So I have more hope that those types of situations that we're seeing in the South China Sea won't devolve in the Bay of Bengal.
You brought up China, so let's stay on that. Let's talk about China's diet and water sustainability. So with China's growing shift toward water-intensive meat and wheat consumption, is this trend sustainable given the country's limited water resources that you spoke about earlier?
I don't think so. I don't think our current diet across the planet is sustainable. We use 70% of the water we use globally goes right to agriculture, and the vast majority of that goes essentially not to our own raising our food, but raising cattle, sheep, etc., raising the feed for them, processing them, making sure they can survive to the harvest time. It doesn't seem to me that's really a sustainable kind of thing. We look, what is it? It takes 2,000 gallons of water to make a pound of beef or something incredible like that. My simple fun factoid is if you really want to save water every day, rather than drinking a glass of milk, if you sit down and drink one beer, at the end of a year, you will have saved this planet 15,000 gallons of water.
Interesting. Well, I too have tried to make some contribution. Now, to be fair, I went the first 50 years of my life eating whatever I wanted to, but over a decade, more than a decade now, I have stopped eating all animal products, and therefore, to your point about sustainability of diets, I have sought to make an impact there as well as with solar energy and other things, and so trying to consider the sacredness of the planet. Here's the next question. Go ahead. Were you gonna?
No.
Yeah. So here we go.
Yeah.
Geopolitical implications of water security is this next question. So, what are the most significant geopolitical implications of water security here in our region?
Again, I would say some of the transboundary water issues that we've touched on are certainly flashpoints in the region, and if they are not handled well, they could result in destabilizing situations. Although equally, we got a bad situation of a king tide, one of these semi-annual, unusually high tides, combined with a powerful storm moving in, for instance, to Bangladesh, where many people, 75% of the country is 3 meters or lower, right? Suddenly we can be faced with the prospect of trying to relocate literally tens of millions of people in a very short period of time into a relatively limited space. Would India help out with this situation? They have not particularly shown any willingness to do so yet. In face of an ongoing massive humanitarian crisis, perhaps they would. I don't know. That has potential. That is a big natural catastrophe like that has a potential to destabilize the situation too. I mean, China, if that happened on the coast of China, they could see the storm coming and just tell 30 million people to move, and 30 million people would move in a matter of days, right? But when you get that particularly across borders and with different forms of government are not quite so heavily in charge, it becomes harder and harder to deal with.
Here's the next question. It's on climate change and water conflicts. What are the best solutions to mitigate water conflicts in regions affected by climate change? And how can major powers contribute to resolving these issues? Now, this is a bit akin to what you just spoke about, but pull on this a little more if you will.
Right. So the big thing ultimately, of course, will be to counteract our increasing heating of the earth. And at the same time, we'll decrease the acidification rate of the ocean. That has to be handled at obviously a very high level. There's not a great deal that the man on the street can do about that. Meanwhile, we all have to start doing adapting to the changes and figuring out ways to, for instance, grow less water-intensive crops in places that are running out of water. So you don't grow wheat in a very dry area. You shift to a crop that needs less water. You don't grow almonds in the Salinas Valley, perhaps, where the ground literally is sinking about an inch a month in the Salinas Valley because they're pumping so much water out. And these kind of shifts, looking at how can we effectively use less water, and again, how can we effectively then recycle our water, take the water that we've used. The way we irrigate, for instance, in many places is sort of insane. During the break day, they're spraying water in huge arcs up in the air where huge amounts of it evaporates to only get a little bit down on the ground. Instead, why not use drip irrigation systems and do it at night, where you get much more of the water hits right into the soil and gets the plant's roots. Some of these systems, a number of versions of it, are not really technologically complex, are not really expensive, but are not yet being used particularly in developing nations that desperately need this kind of technology. And we as the US should be helping those nations, promoting that kind of better use, more efficient irrigation technologies.
One more question. I think I'll just stay in the line of where you're talking about right now. That's about innovative solutions for water management. So the question kind of asks this: what are the most promising innovations for managing water resources in the region that is most affected by climate change?
I think ultimately we are going to master this technology of extracting water from air and literally having systems that relatively simply, relatively quickly, and relatively efficiently will pull water from air. And if we can do that, a whole lot of at least our very basic water problems become very much reduced. We won't need to pump water out so much. The aquifers can gradually recharge if we're not pumping out. Will that happen? I don't know. We're seeing a lot of advances in that particular set of technologies these days, and combined with, I think, lower energy filtration technologies involving nanoscale filters that can remove contaminants of all sorts and types without having to use extreme pressures and lots of energy. Those two technologies together, I think, have a tremendous capacity. But again, they're not going to get anywhere unless we universally adapt this ethic of conservation and stewardship of our water.
Ethan, this has been tremendously insightful for me, and I suspect for our audience as well. Thank you for being here and for sharing this with us. It's been important, so thank you. But before we let you go, I'd like to ask our guests to share a book. And so what have you brought for us today?
So this is a book called The Three Ages of Water by Peter Gleick. He talks about our planetary use of water. The first age was sort of the building of civilizations around water sources and what happened, how we developed the technologies to begin to control water. The second age was our rapid development, industrialization, broad use of water in many, many different systems, building huge complex systems to handle water, and at the same time, polluting many of our resources. And now he points out we are sitting at the cusp of the third age, where we now know how, and the question is, will we clean up our water, clean up our conservation technologies, start using our stewardship the way we know we need to? If we do all that, we're in grand shape, basically. And that's what he points out. And if we don't, well, that's a little grimmer future.
Yeah. We'll include the book recommendation on the show notes. Again, thank you for being here, Ethan.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
As we conclude today's discussion, it's clear that addressing water security in the Indo-Pacific requires urgent, collaborative, and innovative solutions to ensure sustainable access to this critical resource for all. Now, I encourage you to join us on September 23rd for our next Security Nexus webinar, Navigating Tensions in the South China Sea, featuring Doctors Virginia Bakay-Watson and Alexander Vuving. In that session, we'll examine China's territorial claims, its use of military and diplomatic strategies to assert dominance, and the broader implications for neighboring states and global powers, including the United States. From all of us at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, thank you for being part of this important conversation. I'm James Minnich, and until we meet again, aloha oi. As always, The opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.